I'm telling you what, the more we hear from, and thank you both for your expertise, because the more we hear about the fuel tank, the placement of that, the fact that the fuselage did not break apart. I mean, we knew it was a miracle that everyone survived, but it looks like several miracles had to happen in succession to have the outcome that we have that we're talking about this morning.
Yeah, and the pilot kept flying the airplane. It never didn't stop. So, unfortunately, the descent rate, they couldn't fix that at the last moment. And Sherry has probably better look at that than I do.
Yeah, and Sherry, we discussed this earlier. You know, people turn on their TVs and they see the accident in Washington, D.C. They see the fireball coming from the plane in Houston a couple of weeks ago. They see the plane that crashed in Pittsburgh that killed people. They see this when they turn it on, or they pick up this and see it, because that's what we do in news as journalists. We report on it. And they're thinking, I don't know if I want to continue to do this anymore. This is scary, what I'm seeing, because the last month, it hasn't been good for the airline industry. What would you say to those people?
Well, I think if you look at year-over-year statistics, incidents, accidents happen. We've had 20 years without a major airline crash. That last would have been Southwest in Midway when they departed the runway on an icy surface. A very short and challenging runway. But each one of these situations have to be looked at individually. I mean, the engine fire in Houston on takeoff, that was a textbook act by that crew. They aborted that takeoff. Crossfire Rescue was there. They didn't need to evacuate. It was safer for people to stay on board. You have some people coming, so I'll stop. Thank you.
All right. It looks as though we are keeping an eye on the podium there. I want to, you know, when that plane crashed, it looks like people are coming in. We might be moments away. We'll keep a close eye on it. And as soon as they start talking, we'll go to it live. I was actually flying yesterday when I opened my laptop in midair and saw the news of that plane crash. And I can tell you, it shook me a little bit, but I immediately had to remind myself, like you said, Sherry, overall aviation safety in our country is safe. It's when we see things like that, it does shake you emotionally. It does shake your confidence just a little bit. And at that point, it just comes down to having faith in our pilots. Talk to us a little bit, Ken, or Sherry. I'm going to start with you, Ken, on this one, in fact. Weather. When it is snowy, when it is cold, and we know planes have to be de-iced, how important of a component is weather when it comes to situations like this?
Well, de-icing is only prior to takeoff,
right?
Because the plane is capable of de-icing itself in flight. So de-icing is not a real factor when the airplane's landing. Gusty winds would have been more of a factor, or blowing snow. But the weather was fairly clear, some snow on the runway, so the wind gust was more, and the winds were more of a factor in this than the snow or the coldness.
Yeah, Sherry?
Oh, no, I was just going to add, a friend told me yesterday, I think it's like 43,000 flights a day in the U.S. Consider your drive to the airport. That is statistically the most dangerous part of your flight. Look at all the accidents on the highways. You know, we see these big events, and yes, I understand people get concerned, but you have to understand aviation is the safest it's ever been.
Yeah.
Just first blush, when you saw this land the way it did, the descending, to us, lay people, we think, oh, it looks like a normal descent. But we've had several experts on this morning talking about they may have been coming in too fast. Does the icy and the snowy weather have anything to do with that? Or do you go back and say, yeah, it could have been the descent?
I don't believe that there was any icing on the aircraft. If there were, they would have had de-ice on. And so, you know, whether they hit a last-second shear, had a little bit of spatial disorientation from a gust or something. But, yeah, I don't think it was anything to do with icing on the airplane.
Ken, can you talk a little bit about the training? It's remarkable, you know, thank goodness for cell phones in some cases, especially a case like this, because we were able to really get an inside look at what passengers were thinking, what was being said, what was happening as they were trying to get off that aircraft. It is remarkable, the calm that the crew displayed. And I know airline crews are very well trained in terms of emergencies and disasters, but just to hear them in action, that's something you don't get to see every day. Talk about the importance of the training and how that crew knows to jump into action, because they don't have a moment to panic in a situation like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's all about muscle memory and repeatability. So they train and train and train and train 4 times like this. And the passengers were very compliant, but think of how disoriented that is when you're now getting out of your seat upside down and you're walking on the ceiling, which was where the floor used to be. So, but they got out, and positive commands from the crew and the passengers being compliant with that, they got out in a timely manner, and it's really important. And let me add what Sherry was talking about earlier. We have about between 44,000 and 46,000 automobile fatalities per year in the U.S. That would be like a 737. That's 122 people a day that are dying in automobile fatalities. Mm-hmm. That'd be like a 737 crashing 1 per day. So that's a little. That's a good statistic to think about when you're thinking about airline safety.
Yeah, puts it in perspective.
Yeah, a great stat there. And Sherry, let's say the information is released and the investigation is over, and maybe the descent, those pilots, they came in too fast. What should happen? What do you think will happen?
To the pilots?
Is there more training? Are they suspended?
Well, they're suspended now until the investigation is complete. Traditionally, it'll depend if it was determined to be intentional, which I can't imagine it would be. If it was a violation of a federal aviation regulation intentionally, they would lose their licenses. Most likely, however, they'll receive retraining and eventually be back on the line. That is the system. They have, I believe it was Endeavor. They are part of the Airline Pilots Association. They'll have union representation. There'll be a long process for them, but I believe they'll get back in the saddle someday.